I want to train to be a drug educator. If this is a war on drugs, as we're calling it, it seems to be from Mr. Alden's information, I want soldiers to know what end of the gun they're supposed to point, and I want them to be very highly skilled. Another thing that has to be kept in mind with who's teaching it is vigilantes, and are there people there that want to do this with a hidden agenda? Is there some tragedy that they had in their life that makes them want to become a drug educator so that they can somehow share their pain with classrooms? That gets us off the subject of positive reinforcement and having children think of healthy lives. There's another purpose going on, and we want to avoid that. Another point is that we have found that the use of former abusers in drug prevention, and I'm talking about primary prevention, is not a real good idea. There is no better way to help recovering folks than having recovering folks help out. I think if someone's going through the pain of recovery, to have someone that made it say, come on, you can do it, I did it, we can work together, is very important. But I think it's a real mixed message when kids hear a former football player talk about how prison was, and he's making $7,000 to give that talk. The best example I can give you is one that I observed of a former USFL quarterback who was talking to an audience of high school kids, and he was telling them how terrible drugs were and how it ruined his life and his family and everything in between. Well, I'm sitting there watching these kids, and they're sort of looking at him because the man is standing up there in about a 6 or 7 piece suit, and he drove up in a Mercedes, and he's a handsome looking young man, and he's making $250,000 a year. And it made me start thinking, well, how bad was the drug abuse? Maybe if he beat it, maybe I could beat it. I mean, you start getting a mixed message here, and I don't think kids deserve that. I want kids to have the Mary Lou Rettons and the Dave Winfields and the Dan Fouts and the Dan Whites and folks like that of the world standing up there saying, I didn't do drugs, I'm never going to do them, you don't need to do them either. Children deserve a lot of clarity. Next point, right along with that. I don't believe that there's a place for gore and sensationalism in drug education. It's not necessary. It overrides your intended message. Another good example, I was requested to go up to Pittsburgh and observe a presentation by some narcotics detectives that they had put together for elementary children and their parents. And these detectives were really well intended. They meant what they were doing. What they were showing people was what they were scraping off the streets, as I'm sure Mr. Alden's agents get to have to deal with sometimes. But this was decapitated heads and guts coming out and fingers cut off, and everybody had a tag on it on the toe and sores all over the bodies. And the kids, of course, were going, whoa, look at that, wow. But what we missed, the point was that kids spend $3 on Saturdays to go see movies that do the same thing. And that it's not the message of how serious the drug problem is that they're remembering the head sitting there 5 inches away from the body. So we want to be real serious about that. The other part of it is that when a kid goes and smokes pot for the first time with a friend, they're not going to have all that stuff happen to them. They're going to giggle a little bit. So the validity of showing them all this terrible, gruesome stuff gets lost. Along with valid points, to go back to talking about former abusers, when a former abuser makes testimony about how drugs were bad for him, there's a couple things we forget. His experience with the drug and mine with the same drug might be very different. So I can't really relate to what he is saying. The other part of it is that if, as a former recovering person, he didn't smoke crack the night before or he didn't recently do drugs, his information is out of date. And that's the other part of it. A lot of the folks that are doing this and going around the country doing it, most of the kids that I might teach at age 10 or 11 don't know who those people were. Their parents know who they were, but the little ones don't know those folks anymore. They know the current athletes and stars. Next point. Are drugs and alcohol emphasized equally? Alcohol and the abuse of alcohol, you can take all of the costs of abusing all the other drugs in the country, and they still don't add up to the cost of abusing alcohol. So it's vital that alcohol in any drug education be very much emphasized. Along with that, is the information up to date? Is it accurate? When we train teachers, their curricula are in loose leaf notebooks. So if you're working on page 47 of a lesson plan and it's out of date, I'm going to write you and say, take that page out and I'm going to give you a new page so that I can be sure that you're valid. Are materials in drug education easy to use, easy to understand? Are they culturally sensitive? I know that different parts of the country have different cultural needs. Is it rural, urban? All of those things have to be considered. You also have to think about, when you're looking at any kind of drug education effort, is who developed it? How long have they been doing this? There's a whole lot of vendors out there right now. Everyone's got a dog and a pony show, and I'm sure Mr. Alden has most of them at his office, visiting with a puppet and a pony and whatever. It's not going to be a quick fix. This is going to take years and years and years to fix. It took years to get as troubled as we have become. Another thing, another new point with drug education, are self-development skills taught, specifically coping skills? Is peer pressure emphasized? Little kids, I can say to them, you know, peer pressure has 3 parts, and chicken is the most dangerous word in the English language, and that the first part of peer pressure is name calling. You know people are giving you peer pressure when they start saying, what's the matter, you chicken, sissy, baby, scaredy cat, and sometimes they insult your parents. You know that it's going on. The second part of peer pressure that we emphasize is that you have to make a quick decision all the time. No one's ever going to say, can I make an appointment with you for next Thursday afternoon, 4 o'clock behind my garage, and we'll get together and drink a beer? And the kid doesn't have time to say, well, I'd like to think about it, talk it over with my folks, I'll get back to you. It happens very fast. You have to know what you're going to do immediately, and kids have to practice what they're going to do. And the third part of peer pressure is there's never a good, logical, healthy reason. Give me some good, healthy reasons to smoke cigarettes. Okay? Give me some peer pressure reasons to smoke cigarettes. And you can see the difference. Decision-making must be involved in all drug education. There must be a decision-making model. Kids have got to understand that there's a process that they go through, that as much as their parents say no, and their family and their community says no, when something's lit and it's in front of their face, they have to make a decision, and one that could be life-threatening. Assertiveness skills have to be taught, as well as how to cope with stress. You know, sometimes I ask parents, what do you want for your kids? And they say, I don't care, I just want them to be happy. That's not kids' job, as far as I'm concerned. I think that their work is to grow and to develop into all that they're going to become. And nobody's happy all the time. If anyone that's watching here is saying that they're happy all the time, I'm not sure they're being quite honest. That's not what life is all about. There are ups and downs, and we have to teach kids how to work with that. Also, kids need to know where to get help. Mr. Farrell talked about that. They need to know what treatment is. When someone gets sent to treatment, what happens? What's going on? Is it some mystical thing? You need to understand that that's a process. All drug education also has to have information. If you can combine coping skills and good information, then you've got solid curricula. But before you can teach them about stimulants, depressants, hallucinogens, narcotics, inhalants, you got to teach them about what a drug is and why we have them. And isn't it good that we have them? How many of us wouldn't be alive today if it hadn't been for a drug that assisted us when we were seriously ill? We have to teach them about tolerance and dependence and synergism and the difference between street drugs and pharmaceutical drugs. One of the activities we do, and I'm not going to embarrass Mr. Alden by doing it to him, is that we dress a kid up in all of the surgical clothing that you would have to wear to just go and observe where they make legal prescription manufactured drugs. A mask, hair cover, gloves, surgical gown, shoe covers. You got to be that clean just to go in the building where they're making those kind of drugs. Do you think we need all that stuff to go where they make street drugs? I mean, we just saw Fantasia Land or whatever it was that nobody looked like they were really concerned with cleanliness and everything else that we're talking about when you talk about a prescription that changes your body to help you get well. What else do we have to be sure is involved? Alternatives. Kids need some answers. If not this, then what? And they need some practice in that. One of our lessons in the 7th grade is to plan a party. And we divide kids up into teams. And their team is given $50. They have to plan food and invitations and music and activities. And then the class gets back together and hears about the parties, and they vote on which one they'd like to go to most. And the winning team gets a big sticker that says, "Ask me about partying." Kids have to see that there's lots of options, and if you might say $50 is too much, okay, fine. You bring tomatoes, and you bring taco shells, and you bring a pound of ground meat, and we're going to have a taco party. Lots of things like that can happen. Another real important part of any drug education curricula, any drug education prevention effort across the country is parents. You must teach parents what you're teaching their children. If you don't, you're sort of clapping with one hand. And I'm not only talking about teaching parents information, I'm talking about teaching them strategies for their families, how to prevent problems. Also having them remember a little bit about what it was like to be a teenager. A lot of us have this great case of amnesia about what it was like to be 14 because you don't want to remember that you had big feet and you had new odors and you were kind of funny looking and your teeth didn't fit your face and you had elbows down to your knees and all that awkwardness of being an adolescent. It's a tough time. We want parents to remember that. We also want them to learn ways they can help as a family be a support system. There's a wonderful Hispanic lady in Miami that shared with me a couple years ago how she raised her 6 children drug-free. And I said, boy, could be a secret we could really, get across the country. I said, how did you do it? And she said, well, we just have a saying in our family, and that is, in this family, we don't do that. I said, well, that seems pretty simple. How did that work? And she said, well, when one of the kids said, how come John Smith can do this and I can't? She said, I just told them, in this family, we don't do that. I said, well, tell me how that worked. And she said, well, as the 6th child came along, and we'd been using this for so many years, and the 6th child said, how come I can't? The whole family at the table started right in this family, we don't do that. Immediately, it told the child they were special, they belonged to a special unit, that was their family, that they were cared about, and that the family came first. It's a very vital message from a very tiny little exercise. It doesn't help in a family to tell kids not to do something, but yet dad comes home from work and has a couple beers, gets half mesmerized, turns into a fun guy. We're telling kids something real strange there about alcohol and its place in the family. Something else that has to happen in drug prevention, you have to evaluate your efforts. I know it's hard to measure the number of people that decide not to do something, but in the foundation we have been for 10 years pre- and post-testing all of the children that are taught. And we have been comparing and contrasting across the country the success rates. The average test score last year was 43% on a pre-test and 87% on a post-test. You might say, well, BJ, maybe you're teaching them the test. We test the children again 6 months after having the course, and they slid last year from 87 to 79 percentile over 6 months, which is a very high rate of retention. You have to be testing what you're doing so you can show people that you're making a difference. Another point is that curricula has to be age appropriate. I can get elementary kids real fired up about education and real excited about being healthy. And then I can walk into a group of 9th graders. And if any of you have one of those at home, you know what I'm talking about. You know that kind of shrug and, oh, are you here? You have to teach the kids in a different manner. I like to think about teaching adolescents as teaching them slow sinker kinds of education. Things that they hear, they figure out, and then they figure out, well, I get it. I own this. I know this. And that way, that kind of education is going to stick. I want to go back to my key word, and I want to ask you what it was. Class, training. You can buy every teacher in the country a curriculum, kindergarten through 12th grade, for $10. You don't have drug education. You must train, you must update, you must stay with them, you must make sure they are comfortable. Our kids are our legacy. They're our second chance. It's the best second chance I'm ever going to get, although my own children would probably disagree that they don't want to be my rerun. Being a parent isn't easy. It's a hard job, and if I get to be their friend as they grow up, it'll be a bonus, because I see my job as making sure that they're healthy adults. I want to close by sharing with you the point of why we're all here, I think. I heard this a couple years ago at a presentation, and I think it's going to be valid forever. There was a dad who was reading a magazine with his son, and he came across a picture in the magazine of the world. And he called his son in and said, "See this picture of the world?" He ripped it out of the magazine. He said, I want you to take this to your room, and I want you to put it all back together, because I know you're not very good in geography, and this will help you out, and you'll learn where all the countries are in the world. And so his son took the papers and went to his room, and he came back like 5 minutes later, and he had it all together again. And his father said, "How did you do that? How did you get the world back together so quickly?" And the little boy said, "Well, Dad, when you held up the picture of the world, on the other side was a picture of children. And what I did was put all the children together, and I got the world." I hope that all of you in your communities are going to work toward that, because that's just the very best thing that we have, and I hope you get real excited as you do it. Thank you.
Thank you, BJ. And now we'll take a 10-minute break and be back in 10 minutes. Hello, welcome back to Tie-In Network's Drug Abuse Education Program. Our next presenter is another one who's been involved in the field of drug abuse prevention for many, many years. Sue Ruschi was at the beginning of involvement of parents in drug abuse prevention. She was one of the founders of Families in Action, which was established in 1977, and is currently its executive director. She is also a syndicated columnist for the King Features and has a column in King Feature syndicates twice a week. Her Families in Action program is out of Decatur, Illinois, and provides much information in the drug abuse prevention education field. Her information is so reliable that the Drug Enforcement Administration oftentimes has utilized it and co-sponsored some publications with her. And without further ado, let me introduce Sue Ruschi from Families in Action. Sue?
Thank you, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm very honored to be part of this team, which is presenting an awful lot of information for all of you out there to digest. We founded Families in Action in 1977 because a number of things were going on in our community that we didn't like. The first thing was that 6th and 7th grade children in the neighborhood where I live, and my husband lives, and our 2 children live, the 6th and 7th grade kids were discovered to be using marijuana and other drugs. This was in the summer of 1976, back when nobody's kids used drugs. And if you had a child who used drugs, it was probably your fault. That was the thought. That was how people regarded and responded to that kind of information. My husband is a college professor. He teaches at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia, where we live. And right after the discovery of these young children and the fact that they were using drugs, an Emory student flew to Miami, Florida, and was murdered by 2 friends who picked him up at the airport. It turned out that he had $47,000 cash in an attaché case, and he had gone to buy cocaine and was a drug dealer on our campus and in the community where these children were involved with drugs. The kids' parents got together and formed what we now call the nation's first parent peer group. The parents all got together and they were parents of children who were each other's friends or peers. The parents got together and confronted each other with information. Each parent came to the first meeting saying, my kid doesn't use drugs. I've talked to him this afternoon. He swears he's never smoked pot, but I'm here because apparently his friends do. And that parent would no sooner get that out of his or her mouth than another parent would say, oh yeah, your son and my daughter have been smoking pot every afternoon after school for 6 months, and we just found that out from our daughter. They went through that kind of process, and they began to realize that the kids were using, that they had a problem, and they dealt with it. They dealt with it in very simple ways. They punished the children not for using pot, but for lying, for fibbing to them and lying to try to cover up their own involvement with drugs. They grounded the kids. They took away things that really hurt, like being able to talk to each other as friends on the telephone, only for a short period of time. But they got the message across, this is intolerable behavior, you may not do it. The parents were able to extract their kids from the drug culture within about 6 months. Then our Emory student was murdered. The third thing that happened after his death was that shops surrounding the university began introducing lines of drug paraphernalia. This wasn't just, quote, cigarette papers and pipes. It was things like practice grass for 5th graders, teaching children how to use marijuana, what to wear to their first practice grass party, comic books that taught them how to snort cocaine, Frisbee pot pipes so that they could toss a toke to one of their friends, unbelievable toys and gadgets, all of which communicated that mixed message that both BJ and Tom have talked about. The message was drugs are okay, when their parents and society said, drugs aren't okay. So we organized our whole community to begin to fight drug abuse. And I think those are real important words, our whole community. I don't think that it's a family problem. I don't think it's a school problem. I do think it's a community problem. I also think that in many ways, without realizing it, we actually sell drugs to kids. And we don't mean to do that, but I think we're doing that. When we let them watch movies that have glamorous messages about marijuana or cocaine, they're getting very subtle sales messages that it's okay to use these drugs. And I think that's one of the things we can achieve when we come together and organize our communities. I think we can stop that. The first thing that we stopped 2 months after we were organized was that we asked all kinds of leaders in our community to be a part of us. We asked some legislators, we asked police, we asked teachers, administrators, parents, physicians, ministers, et cetera, et cetera. We tried to get a good cross-section of the leadership of the community together. And the first thing we targeted was the paraphernalia, the drug paraphernalia that was introducing children and teaching children how to become drug users. The legislators in our group, within 2 months of our founding, got through the Georgia legislature and passed the nation's first drug paraphernalia statutes. We thought we were going to be a little county organization and that would be the end of it. Within 2 months of our founding and the passage of those laws, people figured out how to spell Russia and started calling me at home on my home phone, which was the only one I had at that point, saying, how did you do that? Can we have copies of those laws? And then those communities would pass versions of the laws. After about 2 years, the laws were beginning to amass at county and city and state levels, and the Drug Enforcement Administration drafted a model drug paraphernalia law that withstood constitutional challenges by the industry. And I'm happy to say that most states now have outlawed the sale of drug paraphernalia on the theory that if drugs are illegal, it makes no sense to invent toys and gadgets that assist their use and have that be legal. I think perhaps in hindsight that drug paraphernalia was the greatest gift any of us received because it became the rallying force. It became a graphic illustration that something was going on other than, quote, bad parents and bad families, that there was some third force out there turning kids on to drugs that had nothing to do with family values or community values, and became the rallying point around which many thousands of parent groups and community groups have organized over the past 10 years. Families in Action over the past 10 years has learned many things. We've helped a number of people get organized and organize parent groups, and we've done a great deal to assist their efforts once they are organized by providing accurate information to them and that sort of thing. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. But one of the most important things we learned is it does take the whole community working together to fight drug abuse. It takes the left hand and the right hand knowing what each other are doing. It's very important to get that coordination going. We also feel that organizing a community group is an ongoing process. It's not something you can do just once, maybe have it go for a year and then disband, because the problems keep surfacing. New problems keep surfacing. They have to be identified, and then jointly working together, they have to be solved. I think perhaps I look at us as being in a transition point now. I think throughout the 70s, the drug myths were as follows. Getting high is fun. Drugs that get you high don't hurt you, and the drug laws are dumb. Those were three major kinds of thinking that we all had to cope with and confront. I think the message of the 80s is getting high has its price. Sooner or later, the drugs that you use to get high will hurt you, and the drug laws may not be so dumb after all. I, for one, think that it is terribly important that we teach children that they are responsible for the consequences of their actions. And I think we must do that in the home. And if we don't do it in the home, then the community will step in and do it in much more severe ways. And I'm talking about courts and incarceration. I don't think that's what we want for our children. But if we abdicate our responsibility as parents, and if we fail to teach our children that there are consequences to their actions, and that we will enforce those consequences, and that we expect them to obey our family rules, and that our family rules parrot and parallel the society's laws, then I think we're in trouble. I think if we've done anything as parents over these years in regards to failure, it is that we have failed to teach kids that they are responsible for the consequences, and that we will hold them to the importance of obeying our rules. I think we've failed miserably at teaching them that we expect them to obey laws. We let them select laws that they're going to obey, and we let them ignore laws that they think they shouldn't have to obey. And I think we've got to focus on that. I'll give you some examples in a minute. I mentioned a few minutes ago that we have, over the years, done a great deal to assist other communities in organizing. We published a manual called How to Form a Families in Action Group in Your Community, which I think the camera is going to show you in a minute. That manual has helped a good number of the folks around the country get groups organized, and it is available if you would like it. Back when we first started, it was very difficult to get across the notion that marijuana, which was the drug most often used by young people, had much wrong with it. Society had pretty much accepted it as a recreational drug and one that was fairly harmless. We felt that to speak about marijuana and to talk about what the scientists were finding out about it, and to try to communicate what the researchers were discovering about this drug, all of it bad news, that to do that, we had to be able to speak from authority, that is, from research publications and articles appearing in medical journals and that sort of thing. So we began collecting information about drugs, and we now have a collection that numbers over 300,000 documents. We add 3,000 to 5,000 every quarter. And we narrow those 3,000 to 5,000 down to about 100, which we summarize very briefly and publish in Drug Abuse Update, which I think you're going to see in just a moment. Update is published quarterly. It brings you information in easy-to-understand language about what the scientists and physicians are learning and discovering about drugs and how they affect people. And it is the best kind of information, I think, that a parent can have to persuade himself about the dangers of drugs and then communicate that information to his child. As Bill mentioned, we also publish various publications. Our most recent is Crack Update, and the Drug Enforcement Administration has co-published that with us, and that is also available to people who are looking for information about crack, the refined form and very potent form of cocaine that is very popular now. When we talk about drug abuse, I think it is terribly important for us to include both tobacco and alcohol along with all of the illicit drugs. I don't think that we can make any sorts of arguments to our children if we don't. In many respects, cigarettes are our most dangerous drug because 350,000 Americans lose their lives every year prematurely because of smoking-related diseases. There's no other drug that kills that many people that often. And I don't think we can look at our kids with a straight face and deny that. In other respects, alcohol is our most dangerous drug. Between 1 and 200,000 Americans die every year prematurely from alcohol-related diseases. And the grief that alcohol brings to many families who get caught up in addiction and dependence is quite different from the effects of other drugs. Those two drugs are legal for adults. They are not legal for kids. And that's the question that I alluded to earlier. That's the law that I think we have done a poor job of teaching our kids to obey. It's illegal for kids to buy cigarettes in almost all states. It's illegal for kids to buy alcohol in every state. It's illegal for stores to sell alcohol to kids, yet that goes on. I have had 10,000 parents tell me, thank God my kid doesn't use drugs, all he does is drink, and they don't recognize what they're saying when they tell me that. The National Institute of Drug Abuse's most recent household survey points very clearly to the fact that both cigarettes and alcohol are gateway drugs for children. 78% of teenage boys, 12 to 17, who smoke also drink alcohol, compared to 25% of non-smokers. 47% of teenage boys who smoke also smoke pot, compared to only 7% of teenage boys who don't smoke. 10% of teenage boys who smoke also use cocaine, compared to less than 0.5%. 57% of teenage boys who drink alcohol also use marijuana, compared to only 10% of the non-drinkers. And 6% of teenage boys who drink use cocaine, compared to less than 0.5%, again, of the non-drinkers. What's more, drinking is beginning at younger and younger ages. By the time children reach 4th grade, over 30% say they feel pressure to drink. By age 13, 1 in 3 boys and 1 in 5 girls is drinking at least once a month. 100,000 5th graders in this country gets drunk once a week. These problems put kids at risk in all kinds of ways. They are at risk for the long-range effects of tobacco, the short and long-range effects of alcohol, and the long-range effects and short-range effects of going into other drugs. If parents organize their community and invite other community leaders to come in, they can begin to resolve some of the problems that you out there, if you're a parent of a teenager, are dealing with right now. For example, parties. What do we do about parties? We want our kids to have fun. We want them to go to parties. But what we don't, or too few of us recognize, is that kids want to go to a party at the house where the adults are out of town, where there are no adults to chaperone, and where drugs and alcohol can be freely available and freely used without any hassle. One thing that you can do if you organize a group is to control those parties. Make rules for your community, for the kids in your kids' friendship group and in your kids' grade. No unchaperoned parties, no open parties. If you have teenagers, don't go out of town for the weekend. It's only 4 or 5 years while they're in high school. You don't need to go out during that time. Stay home, be there. They need you then. I think teenagers need parents even more than little kids need parents, because adolescence is a time when children begin to pull away from parents and test the limits. If you're not there as a parent to set the limits and enforce the limits, the child is going to swim in an ocean and drown in it. You really have to be there for those kids during their adolescent years. If you form a community group, you can do all kinds of things. You can get at drug sales in your community. You can be the eyes and ears for the police. You can form a neighborhood watch group. You can report sales that you see, and you can be willing to go to court and testify against those you see selling drugs. You can ask schools to articulate a clear no drugs policy and do a help kind of program, such as Tom was telling you, but one that also talks about consequences. I think it's very important as we teach our children what the laws are and that we expect them to obey them with regards to drug and alcohol, that we all come to look at the law as a vehicle to use the law to mandate people into treatment, not as a way to punish them for behavior that they can't control. If you form a community group, you can do court watches. You can start going, you can have committees who go into the courts and watch what happens to the disposition of a drug case or the disposition of a DUI. You can learn a lot from doing that, and you have the power to change what you see that you don't like, because judges are elected. Prosecuting attorneys are elected, defense attorneys are not elected, but that's all right. We can deal with that in the courts. We are all citizens of a democracy, and we have a responsibility to exercise our responsibilities as citizens. If we don't like the way things are being run, we can vote new people in. I think we mustn't ever let go of how important that is, and we must never take that power that we have for granted. You can do things about alcohol sales to minors. I want to tell you what we did in our county. We live in DeKalb County. Families in Action is based in DeKalb County. It's a county that is as large as many cities. It has 500,000 people in it. 20 years ago, it was a dry county. I was one of those who voted to make it wet because I didn't like having to go across county lines to buy wine for dinner. But in the 20 years since we voted to make it wet, we've gone from no licensed establishments to sell alcohol to over 850. You can see very quickly what kind of a problem that presents. We sell alcohol in grocery stores, at Kmart's, in drugstores, almost everywhere you can buy alcohol. And trying to enforce not selling it to underage kids is really a sticky wicket. It's very difficult. On top of that, we have stores that sell fake IDs to kids and make a lot of money doing that. We have an out-of-control situation in our county is not different from anybody else's. We formed an alcohol task force because we were getting calls from parents saying, why did my 16-year-old come home drunk Friday night when I thought it was against the law for him to buy alcohol anywhere, and he got it at the convenience store down the street? We didn't have a good answer to that question, and so we formed a task force and we studied the problem. We went to court, we looked at the records, we figured out what was going on, and over a long period we've begun to make a difference. We haven't solved the problem, but we have reduced the number of alcohol sales to kids. Alcohol is an illegal drug for kids. I can't emphasize that highly enough, and that gives you as parents and community leaders an opportunity to see that the laws are enforced to protect kids. Now, if I sound like a blue meanie, I guess I am, and I don't apologize for being one, because alcohol and drugs are responsible for 80% of the deaths of young people aged 15 to 24. They are the only age group whose lifespan is decreasing. Everybody else is living longer except 15 to 24-year-olds. And so many of them are dying from alcohol and drug-related causes that their lifespan is actually decreasing. I think a nation that lets that happen is a nation that has an awful lot to answer for. And I will not be part of that. I will do everything in my power to change that, and I hope you will too. Thank you. Bill?
Thank you very much, Sue. And I want to apologize for Decatur, Illinois. Sue is from Decatur, Georgia. Now I'd like to move along and introduce our next presentation, and that is Texans' War on Drugs, Tyler Thomas. In DEA's never-ending search for additional programs that involve prevention, and in Texans' War on Drugs case, even enforcement initiatives, we're constantly looking for programs that we can sell to other areas. Texans' War on Drugs is a long-established organization that began back in 1979 and has had a major impact in the Texas area on prevention, education, and law enforcement for that matter. And so without further ado, let me introduce Tyler Thomas, the Regional Coordinator from Texas War on Drugs. Tyler?
Thank you, Bill. I'm delighted to be part of this panel to share some of the information that we've been doing here in the state of Texas on prevention through education. I joined the Texans War on Drugs program after completing a career in the United States Air Force. Ironically enough, while in the Air Force, I happened to be stationed in 2 countries in South America, Bolivia and Peru, where roughly 95% of all the cocaine in the world comes from. Of course, at the time, I didn't realize I was being involved in this kind of a program. We saw the natives chewing the coca leaves and seeing some of the effects that was having, but never did we realize that we would be abusing this drug as we've since come to do that here in our country and in our state here, which I'll go into a little bit later. When I got out of the Air Force in 1980, Governor Clements was putting together a program designed to make Texas the least desirable state for drug operations. As he had been campaigning for this role as governor, he was approached by parents and people all over the state asking what he'd do to the greatest problem they were seeing, and that was something that was happening to their children. They weren't exactly sure what it was, whether it was the phase they were going through, whether it was something permanent, but they knew something was happening and they didn't like what they saw. He had made the commitment that if elected, he would place it high in the priorities. And when he was elected, he engaged Mr. H. Ross Perot, an industrialist in Dallas, to head up a program. And he gathered several business people from around the state of Texas and studied the problem and came up with what they call the Texans' War on Drugs. And in essence, it's a three-pronged approach to deal with this problem. They looked at the laws that were on the books and found that some of them were rather loose. They weren't really hitting the drug traffickers where it hurt most, and that was in the pocketbook. And they looked at the paraphernalia that Sarushi had been discussing and found that there were a lot of head shops around. They're operating freely. And this was an open message to young people that it must be okay to do drugs because you can buy all these implements so easily. Nobody questions it as long as you have the money, so it must be all right. These are the kind of things we were seeing. They passed 5 very significant pieces of legislation. They passed the head shop bill. They passed a trafficking bill that held people accountable for drug shipments regardless of what phase they were in the confiscation process. They passed the triplicate prescription bill, which held control over prescription drugs. They passed a licensing revocation bill, which would remove the license from somebody who was abusing the privilege of writing Schedule II or opium derivative type drugs. And he passed the last law that said increasing the penalty to dealing in drugs with minors being 17 years and younger. These have had a marked effect on our state. We're seeing some real benefits as a result of these pieces of legislation, and we expect the more it'll be passed and more ways of combating the drug menace. We realize up front, however, that you're not going to legislate drugs away. You're going to have to go a step further. In so doing, the second pronged approach was through law enforcement. They found there are a number of people in the narcotics area, for example, who were doing some exceptionally good things. They needed to be recognized. They also needed to share some of the latest things that were happening in the law enforcement with some of the regions that were not in the big cities, out in the hinterlands, if you will. And so periodically there are seminars conducted by the Texans' War on Drugs and sharing some of that information. And then once a year they have a banquet to honor the outstanding narcotic officers that have done exceptional work throughout the past year. And then the third pronged of approach, and the one that I've been involved in, is prevention through education. Let's get before the people just what's happening to those who elect to take drugs into their bodies. We don't delve into the legality issue other than to say up front it's illegal, but that in itself is not enough, we found, for kids not to be doing drugs. And it's not a put down for kids, it's just a sign of our times. We also didn't deal heavily in the morality issue. That's really between a child and parents. But the thing that we could zero in on, and the thing that we have found effective in dealing with this subject, is let's talk about what's happening when somebody takes marijuana, for example, into their system. We knew an awful lot about marijuana, but it wasn't getting the front pages of the newspapers. Families weren't aware of just what was taking place. When a kid said, why can't I have a joint? You're having a cocktail. Parents weren't really in the position to say, well, you don't do that because we're talking about different kind of drugs and mine's legal and yours is illegal and that type of thing. Most of it came out across, you don't do it because they say you don't do it. And that in itself wasn't enough. So we needed to provide the kind of information that parents and teachers and any people of concern could talk to young people when they said, what's wrong with it? Is it all that bad? In reviewing the information that was available, we had access to over 8,500 papers on just marijuana alone. Not a single paper gave marijuana a clean bill of health. Every single one of them came to the conclusion it's a dangerous drug. Some thought it may be the most dangerous drug because it was so prevalent, and the effects of marijuana took a long time to take place. It didn't happen overnight or in a week's time, but it took over several weeks and several months in many instances. We learned also that the drug of the 60s, when marijuana came in a rather large scale, the drug of the 60s and in the early 70s, by today's standards, was a relatively mild drug. And let me explain that for a moment. When I talk about the strength of marijuana, I'm talking about the mind-altering ingredient in a marijuana cigarette. We informed the public, as we had learned, that marijuana contains 421 different chemicals. 61 of these are in a family called cannabinoids and are known to no other plant life on this earth. And the one chemical that we were concerned about, and the one that we needed to get information across to the parents, was called in scientific terms delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or simply THC. We asked the people to zero in on those letters, THC. That's the mind-altering ingredient in a marijuana cigarette that gives the problem, that gives the high, that gives the lasting effects. we found that the THC content in the 60s and even into the early 70s was less than 1%. And we found in that time frame as well that the average age of people using this drug, for the most part, was a high school graduate, the college age individual, if you will. And the occasion for using it was, as they applied the term, recreational use, a few joints at a party on occasions. We found in today's standards, things are completely different. First of all, the average strength of a marijuana cigarette in our state in Texas, and I can assure you probably every state that I'm addressing this evening, is now 5 or 6% in strength. And the average age of people using this drug is not limited to college-age individuals or high school individuals or middle school individuals, but it's down in our elementary school. In Texas, the most critical grade is the 4th grade. 25% of 4th graders respond that they're getting some kind of a message that drugs are okay to do, it's fun to do, there's nothing wrong with it, everybody's doing it. And by the time they get to middle school, they're either making up their mind whether to attempt to stay drug-free or whether they're going to succumb to the tremendous amount of pressure that kids are receiving today to do drugs. And unfortunately, that pressure comes from sources that a good number of parents are not aware of. I was not aware of the pressure that my kids were undergoing as they were growing up. I was not listening to the records that they were listening to, the popular songs, which unfortunately so many of the lyrics have do-drug messages in them. I wasn't going to the movies that were popular with that age group, and in some cases still are. I'm talking about the Cheech and Chong type of films, which are very clever artists, but unfortunately they give the message that it's okay to do drugs, it makes you feel good, you got any problems, the problems go away, and everybody seems to think it's cool and smart, and everybody's doing it. We weren't also sharing the same television programs. We weren't watching the Saturday Night Live type of programs, where unfortunately a lot of people were putting down the fact that drugs were harmful, it was cute to do drugs, and some hilarious circumstances on people, well-publicized people were doing drugs and they thought it was kind of funny and it wasn't all that bad. So those are the things that we felt we needed to bring up before the public and before the parents specifically, so that they would have something to look for. In so doing, we found out that if we did present to parents some factual information about these drugs, that we could make a difference. We had a couple of things to go on in that regard. We looked back in the last couple of years or so and saw the whole attitude about cigarette smoking. It's completely changed here in this state, and I think for that part for across the country as well. Not as many people are smoking tobacco cigarettes, certainly in the younger generation, than did before. We now have smokeless areas from which we can consume food in a restaurant. We have people more considerate. If they are still smoking, they're more considerate of those who don't smoke. And there's that overall idea that maybe smoking isn't all that good, and maybe we shouldn't get started. And some of the kids are reading the package labels and saying where it is harmful to your health and that type of thing. The other thing it came across as well was our whole approach to DWIs, driving while intoxicated. No longer are we permitting people to have 6 or 8 DWIs without doing something positive about it, getting them out from behind the wheel of an automobile, getting into some kind of a treatment program, attempt to get them straightened out, but we don't tolerate these consistent DWIs without doing something about it. So in looking with some of the other areas, we found that beyond the traditional health hazards, we found some less dramatic but equally serious things that drugs were doing to our society. And here I'm talking about driving accidents, the leading cause of death among our young people today, accidents in the workplace, learning disabilities that seem to be surfacing all over the country, especially certainly in our state, a disruption of normal reproductive functions, and damage to some of the organs in the body, like the heart and lungs and some of those. We found out that there was a direct relation, or would be perceived to be a direct relation, between drug usage and some of these things that were occurring. So in getting this information out to parents and so forth, we elected to go in about 4 main areas. And I just want to touch on them briefly because it has worked in our state. It seems to be working. Kids seem to pick up on these things. And I think by sharing it, it may be of effect and helpful to you as well. We talked about 4 main areas. We talked about what marijuana, THC, for example, is doing to the brain, what it's doing to the reproductive system of both male and female, what it's doing to the immune system, and what it's doing to the respiratory system. Our feeling was if we could get somebody to zero in on at least 1 or 2 of those, and that may be sufficient enough to say, hey, I don't want to get fooled, I don't want to fool with it. It's just not worth the risk. In some of the research that we drew from, we found that marijuana does affect the brain. It affects the short-term memory, a person's ability to retain information. Critical, of course, to kids in school, but critical in any facet of life. If you can't remember something, you're going to have difficulty making it in this world. We emphasize the point that people are making a living by their head, not by their hands today, and kids need to understand that. We talked about the fact that it affects the attention span, a person's ability to focus in on a subject and keep that kind of information for any length of time. We talked to parents about behavioral changes, the fact that kids are doing things differently if they're on drugs. They're not the sweet, loving child that they may have been used to around the family, but somebody more concerned about what's it in for me. Of course, the normal things about grade drops and those kind of things were also mentioned. The overall thing was there's every bit of evidence that seems to say that it is doing permanent brain damage. And until we have conclusive proof, the bottom line is, do we really want to run that risk? I think not. In the reproductive area, we found that it affects both male and female. We found some significant things that are happening. We found some of the experiments that are going on in both those areas, and sharing some of that with the high school kids and middle school kids, for that matter as well, seems to make an impact. We found in the respiratory system, for example, a lot of kids were not smoking tobacco cigarettes, but they didn't see anything wrong with smoking a joint on occasions, not realizing that in the cancer-causing ingredients in the tar carcinogen, one marijuana cigarette is roughly the equivalent of 16 to 20 tobacco cigarettes. We needed to get that kind of information across to kids, and we seem to be able to do that little by little, and parents seem to be picking up on that as well. And in the immune system, when kids are learning what the function of the red cells and the white cells are all about, we shared with them the fact that when somebody has THC into their system, they don't have the same white cell count that non-smokers have. What does that mean? They're more subject to diseases, less able to ward off diseases, and that type of thing. In this day and age where kids are concerned about their bodies and the robustness and good eating and some of that thing, maybe those are the kind of things that take over. So that was the thing in marijuana. There are a number of other drugs that we were concerned about. Alcohol, a real problem with the drug alcohol for kids that are under the age, under the legal drinking age. We found that a person who takes this drug into their system before they're fully developed, and we emphasize the fact that you're not fully developed by size, but by certain age, 21, 22 years old. And if you take this drug into your system before that time, you run the risk of having some real problems. We shared some of the statistics on alcohol, and we say in this country roughly 10 to 12 million alcoholics. But how many people would realize that 3.3 million of them are between the ages of 14 to 17 years old? Not able to buy alcohol legally, but these are full-blown alcoholics. Parents need to understand that. Kids need to understand that as well. State of Texas, we've had some other problems. I think it's not unique in Texas, but it's one that we're dealing with, and that's inhalants. Getting high on fumes. It's been a big problem here. I'm talking about, it used to be airplane glue, paints, spray paint, gasoline, any type of thing that you can put in a container and sniff in the fumes and get high. We try to get across to kids, it's one of the most serious types of drug abuse because it does permanent brain damage. And we try to show where somebody has been doing this for 3 or 4 years, they're just not going to be able to function normally, and somebody's always going to be responsible for taking care of them. So those are some of the things that we've done. We followed Surushi's examples of families in action by going into communities. We try to find the leaders in the communities, not only in the government, but people in the school system, the law enforcement, the families, and so forth, and to come together, as she described in her book, on having a program designed for that particular community. The Texans War on Drugs can go in, the coordinators go in and explain what drugs are doing, but then we incorporate somebody from the community, hopefully it's a law enforcement person who can say, okay, you've heard what drugs are doing, now these are the places that some of our kids are experimenting with drugs, and these are the kind of drugs that they're using. So it brings it back home, and it takes, and hopefully that will be enough of interest for community leaders to come up with programs designed for that particular program. We're fortunate that when we put the Texans War on Drugs program together, we not only had state coordinators, regional coordinators as we call them, but we had state coordinators as well in the area of the minority coordinator, the youth coordinator, and the law enforcement coordinator. So we feel we can cover the state of Texas in just about every facet that's needed. We're getting more and more into drugs in industry. We're seeing some remarkable changes that are occurring with the role that industry is playing in the community, and for good reason. The toll that drugs are taking in industry is certainly crippling. I think some of the latest statistics I've read, the neighborhood of $60 billion a year lost in lost productivity, increased medical costs, and crime. And of course, no country, no matter how wealthy we are, can substantiate those kind of losses and be productive in the world market today. So the fact that drug screening is one of the things that's being considered as a means of getting drugs out of the workplace is certainly encouraged by the Texans War on Drugs. All in all, it's been a program that's been most gratifying. We enjoy the close association with DEA and with the other various organizations around the states, Families in Action, and some of the programs that we've tied in with and share the experience and the information that we've gained and that they share with us. I'm going to be ready to answer some questions later on in the program. At this time, I think I'll turn it back to Bill, and you've got it.
Thank you very much, Tyler. You know, recently, this past summer, this nation was shocked by the deaths of 2 athletes that died as a result of drug overdoses in less than a week. That was the University of Maryland basketball All-American Len Bias, followed by the tragic death of Don Rogers, the defensive back of the Cleveland Browns. We at DEA have known for a long time that athletes play a major role in the impact of not only our youth, but on all of us, that they are our examples and that we use them as role models. Unfortunately, those untimely deaths were an indictment, but certainly not all of the professional athletes. And the majority of professional athletes, we find, are drug-free. One of the guests that we're going to have on next, Danny White from the Dallas Cowboys, is in that role. What we wanted to do first before we bring Danny up is show you a public service announcement that Danny was kind enough to participate in recently with the Drug Enforcement and FBI in Dallas, Texas. So if we could show that public service announcement now.
I'm Danny White of the Dallas Cowboys. As a quarterback, I'm paid to make decisions on the football field all the time. Off the field, there are decisions to be made also. One of those decisions has to do with drugs, and millions of Americans have made it. They've decided to get drugs out of their lives. Join them. It's the right thing to do. The smart thing. Team up. Say no to drugs.
From the Drug Enforcement Administration FBI Sports Drug Awareness Program in this station.
And now, Danny White of the Dallas Cowboys.
I'm very honored to be a part of this panel tonight. And I'm here basically to talk about the role of professional athletes and perhaps even the role of celebrities in this war against drugs. I'm reminded, first of all, of a young man in this situation who many years ago used to sneak into the general store. And when the storekeeper wasn't looking, he'd stick his fingers down in the big barrel of molasses that was next to the cash register and have a nice big taste of molasses. And one day the storekeeper turned around and caught him right in the act, decided that he was going to teach the boy a lesson. So he came out from behind the counter and picked the boy up by the ankles and turned him upside down over that barrel of molasses. And he let go. And as the boy disappeared into that barrel of molasses, he was heard to say, "Lord, give me a tongue equal to this opportunity." Well, I feel a little bit like that tonight because I know there are a lot of people watching and listening, and I feel a tremendous obligation to say something that might be beneficial in some way. Because I think all of us as professional athletes, and certainly all of us who are in the limelight, have an obligation to try to set the kind of example that needs to be set. There's been a lot of talk recently about the National Football League and its attempts to set up a drug rehabilitation program, and there have been talks about random urinalysis testing. I can sum my feelings up very very briefly by repeating the quote of a sportscaster in Dallas by the name of Brad Sham. I was listening to the radio one day driving down the freeway, and he came on with an editorial and was talking about urinalysis testing and how the players' unions were fighting the fact that they were talking about giving spot checks and random testing. And Brad came on and he said, you know, for the amount of money that those guys make, they ought to be willing to urinate in a bottle standing on their head. And it struck me as funny at first, and then when I stopped to think about it and about the impact that we have and the example that we set and the tremendous positive step we could take, it really sunk in, because I really feel that we're in a position as professional athletes to set an example and to make a statement. Hopefully this year, with the collective bargaining agreement being renegotiated, we'll be able to do that. One of the problems in the past has been the fact that the collective bargaining agreement has not spelled out any sort of drug program, or at least not any random testing, and that's something that we'll address this year, hopefully. We have a lot of opportunities as professional athletes. I've had opportunities to visit rehab centers, drug abuse centers, alcohol abuse treatment centers, and cancer treatment centers. And I've had an opportunity to talk with a lot of the people in those centers. And the question I'd like to ask to most of them is, if you had it all to do over again, what would you do differently? And the response 99% of the time is the same. That response is, I would give anything I own if I hadn't smoked that first cigarette, or drank that first beer, or smoked that first joint, because that's where it all begins. Those kind of opportunities are priceless to me, and I wish in some way that we could all talk to those people and visit with them and realize the dangers and the hazards that are presented by the use of drugs and alcohol. I would personally be very proud to be associated with an industry that would be willing to take a step forward and incorporate random drug testing in our programs. And I honestly and truly feel that 95% of the players in the National Football League feel the same way. And I'm very confident that something along those lines will be drawn up in our next collective bargaining agreement. One of the things that I guess I'm most disappointed about in our industry, and one of the things that I feel very strongly about, is the fact that drug abuse starts very innocently in a lot of cases. Maybe the first time somebody drinks a can of beer or smokes a joint. As I talked about earlier, that's the one step that a lot of people would love to have to do over again. And I'm a little bit ashamed every time I turn on a sports program and watch a football game or a basketball game to see the athletes, or the ex-athletes at least, that support the alcohol industry. And I'm talking about the